Hello again, this is Mr. Liao, and this is the 2019 Set 1 Macro FRQs. So number one, Canada is an open economy that is currently in a recessionary output gap. So we are asked to draw essentially a aggregate demand, aggregate supply graph, and you can see the labels as required. So x-axis real GDP, y-axis price level, AD intersects SRAS at Y1 with a price level of PL1 because there's a recessionary gap. LRAS is to the right of short run equilibrium, so YF is to the right of Y1, and that indicates the recessionary gap. Part BI, the central bank and the government do not take any policy actions to close the output gap. Explain how the economy will adjust to full employment in the long run. So remember, if the government doesn't do anything, SRAS is going to shift back towards full employment. So with the recessionary gap, input prices and wages are expected to decrease, which will cause SRAS to shift to the right until real GDP reaches full employment at YF. So remember, if the government doesn't enact any policy, SRAS will eventually shift left or right, depending on whether there's a recessionary or inflationary gap, back to the level of full employment. B2, on your graph in part A, show how the economy adjusts to full employment in the long run. So SRAS is going to shift to the right, and let's put the price level down to PL2, and the output level is at YF. C, suppose the Canadian government is unwilling to wait for the long-run adjustment process. The marginal propensity to consume is 0.8. The equilibrium real output is 500 billion, and the full employment output is 540 billion. Part C1, calculate the minimum change and indicate the direction of change in government spending required to shift the AD curve by the amount of the output gap. So our output gap is $40 billion, the difference between real output at equilibrium and the full employment output. So the spending multiplier is 1 over MPS, which is 1 over 1 minus MPC, which is 5. So the government spending has to increase by 40 billion, which is the amount of the gap, divided by the spending multiplier 5, or $8 billion. So that's the minimum change in spending that's required to close the recessionary gap. C2, calculate the minimum change and indicate the direction of change in taxes required to shift the AD curve by the amount of the gap. So $40 billion, tax multiplier is 1 minus the spending multiplier, or -4. You can also treat it as +4 as long as you remember which direction you need to handle the taxes by. So here the taxes have to decrease by a minimum of 40 billion, which is the amount of the gap, divided by 4, or $10 billion. If you use the -4, negative just means taxes had to be cut by 40 billion divided by -4, or $10 billion. D, assume instead that the Canadian Central Bank takes actions to restore the economy to full employment by influencing investment spending. Draw a correctly labeled graph of the money market and show the effect of the actions taken by the central bank on the equilibrium interest rate. So money market has nominal interest rate on the y-axis, quantity money on the x-axis, money supply is vertical, money demand is downward sloping. There is R1, which is your interest rate. Now, to increase investment spending, the central bank needs to lower the nominal interest rate, which can be done by increasing the money supply. So money supply shifts to the right, thereby lowering the interest rate. That lower interest rate will stimulate investment spending and cause the gap, the recessionary gap, to eventually close. Part E, Canada and Mexico are trading partners. Draw a correctly labeled graph of the forex market of the Canadian dollar and show the effect of the change in interest rate in Part D on the dollar. So Canadian dollar, so quantity of Canadian dollars on the x-axis, the peso per Canadian dollar on the y-axis. Remember, the currency you're looking at goes in the denominator for the y-axis. There's our graph. Canadian interest rates are now lower, which means Mexican investors are going to want to invest less in Canadian assets. Remember, the money flows to the higher interest rate because higher interest rates mean higher rates of return on investment. So that's going to cause the demand from Mexican investors for the Canadian dollar to decrease. So the Canadian dollar demand decreases. Notice that the exchange rate for the Canadian dollar goes down against the peso, so the Canadian dollar depreciates against the Mexican peso. Alternatively, you can think of it this way: Canadian investors will now rather invest in Mexican assets, and that's going to cause them to demand more Mexican pesos. So looking at the other side, to obtain those pesos, Canadians are going to supply more Canadian dollars. So they're going to demand more pesos. To get those pesos, they need to supply dollars. Supply of Canadian dollars shifts to the right. That's also going to cause the Canadian dollar to depreciate against the peso. So either approach is fine. Number 2, assume the expected inflation rate in a country is 3%, the current unemployment rate is 6%, and the natural rate of unemployment is 4%. Part A, draw a correctly labeled graph of the short run and long run Phillips curves. Label the current short run equilibrium as point X and plot the numerical values above on the graph. So here's a Phillips curve, unemployment rate on the x-axis, inflation rate on the y-axis. Long run Phillips curve is vertical, short run Phillips curve downward sloping. We are told that the expected inflation rate, is 3%, and the natural rate of unemployment is 4%, so those are labeled. We also have point X, so we don't know the inflation rate, but we know the unemployment rate at point X is 6%. So obviously the graphs don't have to be to scale. You just have to indicate X on SRPC and indicate the 6% unemployment rate below it. B is the actual inflation rate greater than, less than, or equal to the expected inflation rate of 3%. And as you can see by the Phillips curve, and that's the inflation rate on the left, you can see at point X, the inflation rate is actually less than 3%. So that's the indication based on the higher unemployment, inflation rate goes down. C, assume loans were made taking into account the expected inflation rate of 3%. Will lenders be better off or worse off after they realize the actual inflation rate identified in Part B? Explain. So lenders are going to be better off because the real value of the loans that will be repaid is higher than expected. Because lenders were expecting 3%, inflation is actually less, which means that money actually has more purchasing power that they're getting repaid. So just as a reminder, when inflation is less than the expected inflation, lenders are better off. When the actual inflation rate is higher than what was expected, then the borrowers are better off. Part D, based on the relationship between the actual and expected inflation rates in Part A, what will happen to the natural rate of unemployment in the long run? And the answer is the natural rate of unemployment is not going to change in the long run. The only thing that changes NRU is long-term or long-run economic growth or long-term economic shrinkage. Nothing else will change NRU in the long run, but for a change in the economic conditions. Number 3, assume that households in Econland increase their savings for retirement. Using a correctly labeled graph of the loanable funds market, show how the increase in savings will affect the equilibrium real interest rate. Loanable funds graph, real interest rate on the y-axis, quantity of loanable funds on the x. There is your initial equilibrium point. An increase in savings is going to cause the supply of loanable funds to shift to the right. Thus, the real interest rate goes down. So anytime there's more savings, that means more money is going to be available for banks and lending institutions to loan out to possible customers, whether it's businesses or consumers. So increased savings, increased supply of loanable funds, decreasing the real interest rate. B, based solely on the real interest rate in Part A, what will happen to Econland's purchases of foreign assets? Explain. So because Econland's real interest rate is now lower, relatively lower, interest rates in other countries are going to be higher than that of Econland. So that means Econland is going to purchase more foreign assets as econ investors will look for a higher rate of return abroad. So now that the real interest rate is lower, Econland investors are going to want to invest in the area, in the countries with higher interest rates. Part CI, consider the foreign exchange market for Econland's currency. Based on your answer to Part B, what will happen to the international value of Econland's currency? So Econland investors are going to want to demand more of the foreign currency because now the interest rates are relatively higher abroad. So that's going to mean Econland is going to demand more of the foreign currency. To get that foreign currency, they're going to supply more of their own. That's going to cause Econland's currency to depreciate. C2, based on your answer to Part C1, would Econland's central bank buy or sell its currency in the foreign exchange market to offset the change in the value of its currency? So Econland wants to strengthen its currency or make its own currency to appreciate. Now, if you look at the possible outcomes, that's going to mean Econland, they're going to want to buy its own currency. That's going to increase demand for its currency. That's going to cause its own currency to appreciate. If they sold their own currency, that would increase supply of their currency, which would further weaken the Econland currency. So the answer is they're going to demand more currency. They can do that by buying more of its own currency on the foreign exchange market. That's it for 2019 macro set 1. If you have any questions, feel free to send me an email or leave a message on Google Classroom.